Today's Tanya for the 6th day of Shevat is in Perek Chav, chapter 20. It's on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph. The number at the bottom of the page is 86. There are three kinds of Ava and Yira, of love and fear, that a Jew is capable of. The first is a love and a fear that is created out of intellect, out of the knowledge of God and the contemplation of God's greatness, that produces the emotion in the heart, because the mind, intellect, produces emotion, and emotion is born out of intellect. This love and fear is called Ava v'Yira Sichlis. The other level of love and fear is the love and fear that is not in the revealed part of the heart and mind, but in the recesses of the heart and mind. And that is a conviction of love and fear. This too is created through understanding of God's greatness and through contemplation of God's greatness. Only it is not a clear enough or strong enough understanding to produce an actual emotion in the revealed part of the heart, and produces instead a conviction of love, a conviction of fear in the recesses of the heart. The third Ava v'Yira is called the Ava Misuteres, the concealed love that every Jew has in his heart by virtue of his neshama, since every godly soul, in the chachma of the soul, there is a presence of the Ein Sof, of God Himself. That presence is what produces the Mesiras Nefesh in a Jew. The capacity for Mesiras Nefesh, the ability to give up his life and not sever himself from God. This is also where Emunah comes from. Emunah meaning that a person sees godliness, or godliness makes itself known and felt to the person, and therefore he doesn't need intellectual proofs, and he doesn't need personal experiences to prove to him the reality of godliness. He sees godliness. God shows him, the truth of godliness shows itself to him. It is from that level that a Jew is incapable of severing his connection to God. And that's why when he is asked to bow to an idol or die, he can't choose death in order, he can't choose the idol in order to avoid death, in order to save his life. He cannot bow to the idol because he cannot sever himself from God. So it's not just the sin of idolatry, it is not the seriousness of Avodah Zarah that makes the Jew capable and willing to give up his life. It's the fact that when it comes to Avodah Zarah, it is clear that the issue is not a particular Avodah, a particular sin. The issue is severing your relationship with God, denying that relationship. And this a Jew cannot do. And that explains why other sins he is capable of doing, and that's why he is the lowest of the low. As the Rebbe says, and even after he has had the Mesiras Nefesh, he remains the lowest of the low. Only at the time of the Mesiras Nefesh, his emunah and his Mesiras Nefesh is so strong that it influences every part of his body and every part of his system, so that even in an external, meaningless act, without believing in the idol at all, he cannot bow or give lip service to the idol, because to that degree he would be severing his connection with God. Were we able to see that every sin severs that connection, that it's not a question of this Aveda or that Aveda, it is the question is turning away from this connection and from this attachment to God, then every Jew would be incapable of committing any sin, because every sin means a separation. This love that does not permit a Jew to be separated from God includes also a fear, so that the love and fear that come from the hidden love, from the nature of the neshama, that love can animate and motivate the performance of every mitzvah and the avoidance of every sin, if we could see the sin in that light. And for this, the Alter Rebbe begins to explain in Perek Chav that the first two commandments of the 10 Commandments I am God, your God, you shall have no other gods, that is two ways of saying, of expressing the oneness of God. The oneness of God is expressed in the positive, I am God, therefore no one else is, and you shall have no other God, therefore God will be your only God. So it's both the positive and the negative way of saying that God is the only one. But to understand this, why the first two commandments represent all the commandments, the first command representing all positive commandments, the second commandment representing all negative commandments, to understand this more properly, we have to explain what it means that Hashem Echad, Achdus Hashem. Because the oneness of God can mean that God is the only creator. The oneness of God can mean that God is a single being, not composed of many parts. Or the oneness of God can mean that God is the only existence, the only reality, and there is no existence and no reality other than Him. And in that aspect of Achdus, we have to explain how is it that God is the only existence when we see that the world exists also. There's a created being. So for this, the Alter Rebbe explains that since the whole world was created from a word of God, and a word is totally insignificant compared to God Himself, therefore, if that brought into existence a world by simply saying, let there be, those words and that breath of God's mouth is so insignificant that it doesn't change God's status at all, and just as He was alone and exclusive in His existence before the world was created, His existence is still that equally exclusive after the world was created. Now, a third of the way down on the page, the Rebbe will explain this further with a mashal from the human soul at the period. As for example, in the human soul, when a person speaks dibur echad, one word, this word alone, kilom mamosh, is so insignificant, it's as if it doesn't exist. If we were to compare this one word only to the speech ability of the soul, how much speech, how many words can a soul speak? Shehu bechinas levushu emtzoi shelo, shehu kayach hadibur shelo, this garment of speech, which is the middle garment of the soul. Between the three garments, action, speech, and thought, thought is the inner garment, action is the external garment, and speech is the middle garment. A soul can speak infinite words, so that if we compare one word to the soul's capacity for speech, already the one word is lost in its insignificance. It's as if it doesn't exist compared to the potential that the soul has for speech. But this insignificance is a quantitative one. One word compared to the endless amount of words that a soul can speak. How much more so when we compare a word, a spoken word, to the inner garment of the soul, shehu hamachshava, which is the garment of thought. If we compare a word, a spoken word, to the thought of the soul, shemimena nimshechu hadiburim, from which the speech comes, because a person has to think before he can speak, so the thought is the source and the origin of speech. So when we were to compare a spoken word to the thought of the soul's ability to think, then the insignificance is that much greater. Here, the insignificance is a qualitative one. Speech is a much lower faculty, a much lower garment than is thought. Thought is a much more refined quality, much more refined characteristic of the soul, so that it's no longer only a question of quantity, that single word compared to the endless number of words, but rather the spoken word compared to thought. There it certainly loses all its significance. Particularly since thought is the source of the word, vehi chayusam, and remains even after the word is spoken, or as the word is spoken, the thought remains the life and the energy behind the speech. So in the presence of the thought, the word loses its significance even more. And it goes without saying that that if we were to compare the spoken word not only to the capacity of speech, not only to the thought of the soul, but to the soul itself, which are the 10 powers of the soul, as that were described earlier, Chachma, Bina, Das, etc., and then the emotions. It is the emotion and the intellect, the understanding of the soul, that are the ultimate source of the spoken word and of the thought, because all thought and all words describe or express either a feeling or an awareness, either what the soul knows or what the soul feels. The comparison of the spoken word to the soul is a much greater distance, a much greater insignificance than when we compare the spoken word to thought, because even thought contains letters. Thought is made up of letters, so that the combination of the Eid and the Keli, of the light and the vessel, in Machshava, the Keli is very prominent, and therefore the light is much smaller, whereas in the emotion and in awareness, in knowledge, before it comes into thought, there are no letters at all, as we'll soon describe. Where there are no letters, then the light, the Eid, is unhindered and unrestricted. It's a higher sort of light, and therefore it doesn't come into the vessels or into the limitations of letters, of images. So again, because thought also is made up of letters, of images, just as speeches. Only they are more spiritual and more refined, less physical. And therefore, if we compare speech to machshava, the speech is very insignificant, but not as insignificant as it would be when we compare it to the soul itself, to the emotions and to the intellect. Because there is some similarity between speech and thought in that they both contain letters. They both come in the form of images. But the 10 powers of the soul, Chachma, Bina, Das, etc., the emotions of the soul, they are higher than thought. They are the source of thought. And being that they are the source of thought, thought is where letters and images come into existence, so that which is higher, that which is the origin of thought, there are no letters at all. Before the intellect is clothed in the garment of thought, the intellect contains no letters. So when a person understands something, he obviously understands it with letters. But that's after the understanding has already come into thought. But the understanding itself does not utilize letters in its process of development. We don't come to know something through letters. First we come to know something. The soul discovers something, which is called intellect. And that knowing, that awareness, immediately expresses itself in letters so that a person can think about it and know what it is that he knows. But the knowing comes without letters. As the Rebbe will say later, that's why people speak and think in various languages, but all people know the same. There are no different languages to knowing, so that a person who speaks Hebrew doesn't know in Hebrew, where a person who speaks in English knows in English. They both know without language. Only to express what they know, they each turn to the language familiar to them, and those are the letters and the images of their language with which they think and speak. L'moshel kisheneflis eze nefeles eze ava v'chemda b'libi shel adam, when some love or desire enters into the heart of a person, before it rises from the heart to the mind, where it will become a thought. First it starts in the head. You have to know about something. Then you can develop a feeling for it. And then from that feeling it rises back to the head and becomes a thought. So when it is still in the heart, the emotion, and it hasn't gone back from the heart to the mind to become a thought, it doesn't yet have, the emotion does not yet have letters or forms, images. Rather, it is an undefined desire and leaning towards that thing which the soul finds pleasurable. And if we were to go back a step further, before this thing became a desire in the heart, before he wanted it in his heart, it existed only, the subject or the object existed only as a knowledge, an awareness in the mind. The person knew that there was such a thing, and that such a thing is good. He was aware of it, and he knew that this thing was good and desirable and pleasant and nice to have and to cleave to. As for example, he knew that there was a subject in wisdom that was desirable to have, or there was some food that was pleasant to eat, and it hasn't yet become a desire. It hasn't yet become a feeling in the heart. It is only after it becomes an emotion and a desire in the heart. And then it returns and goes back up from the heart, from the feeling, to the mind, and then it becomes a thought, or even a plan. When he starts to think or plan how to attain, how to satisfy this desire, either by learning the subject or by getting the food which he desires to eat. It is only here, it is only at this point that letters come into existence in the mind. And these are the letters that make up the languages of the various peoples. So it is only on the return, when the thought returns to, when the feeling returns to the mind to become a thought or a plan, that's where letters and images come into existence in the mind. But before that, even while it was in the heart and there was a pure emotion, before it became a thought, there were no letters there. It wasn't contained in any letters. It was an unrestrained thought, unrestrained emotion. And certainly prior to that, before it even became an emotion, when it was merely a knowledge in the mind, not yet a thought in the mind, but a knowledge in the mind, there certainly there were no letters at all. Knowledge comes in a pure form without any figures, without any images which would be thought. And therefore, if we were to compare speech to the emotions and to the intellect of the soul, there would be no comparison there at all. The word, the spoken word, would be totally insignificant, non-existent, because in the soul itself there are no letters at all. It's a completely different substance, a completely different level of soul power, of movement of soul, where the soul leans or tends towards something, either in knowledge or in intellect or in emotion, whereas speech is a garment, and it is a lower garment than thought, and so on. So the bittul, the non-insignificance, the non-existence of all that is created, is the result of the insignificance and non-existence of that part or of godliness with which the world is created. Since the speech which makes up the whole world, the Word of God, is so insignificant and non-existent compared to God Himself, even compared to the speech of God, certainly compared to the thought of God, and infinitely so compared to the attributes themselves, that's why the world, when it comes into existence, does not change in any way and to any degree the status of God's oneness and God's exclusive existence, because the world, and even that which creates the world, is totally insignificant. In the Hayom Yom for the 6th of Shevat, the Rebbe writes that my father wrote that he heard from the Alter Rebbe, in other words, the Rebbe Rashab writes that he heard from the Alter Rebbe that all the authors in Torah, until the Taz and the Shach, the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, and they included, wrote their works with Ruach HaKodesh. And the idea of Ruach HaKodesh, it says in Karb Mo'ed, the Seif Perek Gimel of Shkolim, that Ruach HaKodesh means when one has secrets of Torah revealed to him. And this comes from the level of Helem de Chachma, which means that part of Chachma that is not yet Seichel, the part of Chachma that we experience as Emunah and Mesiras Nefesh, as is described here in Tanya, by the person with Ruach HaKodesh, that level comes down into Seichel, and they actually understand that which we have to believe.